Welcome to the third part of the wolf tutorial. This time, we will cover the 3D sculpting of the model. Sculpting in 3D is a lot like sculpting a physical object such as clay. Blender, like other 3D software, simulates the sculpting tools that allow you to completely manipulate your model. When sculpting in 3D, it is advisable to use a graphics tablet. You can always use your mouse, but I think a graphics tablet makes a difference when it comes to 3D sculpting and digital art in general. For this tutorial, I used the Wacom one, which is a small and affordable graphics tablet. Then again, you can also use the mouse, although I find it more difficult. Before we start sculpting our mesh, there are a few rules we need to be aware of. First, to sculpt anything in 3D, we need a high number of polygons in our mesh. This is because when sculpting a model, we are not adding or subtracting polygons, but simply using the polygons that the mesh already has. In short, the more polygons, the more details we can add. With this in mind, we might think that the solution is to use a subdivision surface modifier to subdivide the mesh into more polygons. But even though this works, it is not the best solution. If we add a subdivision surface modifier to a mesh and start sculpting in it right away, we'll notice that we're not actually sculpting in the subdivided mesh, but in the original one. To be able to sculpt in the subdivided mesh, we would need to apply the subdivision surface modifier. See the difference? This works, but it has a problem. Once the mesh is subdivided and the subdivision surface modifier is applied, you cannot go back. Meaning, your mesh will be subdivided forever. So whenever you need that same mesh with fewer polygons, whether to improve the performance of a render, or even to speed up the workflow, you won't be able to do it. Fortunately, Blender has a modifier called multi-resolution that allows you to subdivide the mesh while retaining all the subdivision levels. This means that you will be able to subdivide your mesh, sculpt in the highest subdivision level, and then return to a lower subdivision level at any time if needed, and vice versa. In fact, you can even choose the subdivision level that you want to be visible, in the viewport, while sculpting, or in the render. To start sculpting, we need to select the Sculpt mode. In the Sculpt mode, we have the Brushes panel on the left, where we can select the brush that best suits our needs. In the panel on the right, we can find the tool settings that gives us further control over the brushes. We can also find some settings in the top menu, like the brush radius and strength. Another cool thing that the multi-resolution modifier has to offer is the Sculpt Base Mesh option. In short, if this option is off, the mesh itself will not be affected, so if you enter Edit mode, you will notice that the mesh remains untouched. If the Sculpt Base Mesh option is enabled, the mesh will be affected by the sculpting. So if you sculpt something and then enter Edit mode, you'll be able to see the changes in the mesh. With all of this in mind, we can start sculpting our wolf. Since the last tutorial, I have upgraded Blender to 4.2, so you might want to do it too. Again, it is not strictly necessary to do so, but it will probably make it easier to follow this tutorial. We will start with the wolf's body, so let's select it, and remove any subdivision surface modifier that it might still have. Now add a multi-resolution modifier. We want to subdivide the mesh. Remember that the more we subdivide it, the more details we can add through sculpting, but this also means that the computer will use more resources and may become slower, so we need to be careful not to overdo it. So let's subdivide the mesh a few times. I think if we subdivide it 4 times, we can add a decent amount of details through sculpting. Feel free to subdivide it further if your computer can handle it. Now to start sculpting, we need to select the Sculpt mode in the top left. We now have the Brushes panel on the left. On the right panel, select the Tool tab to open the tool settings. When sculpting symmetrical characters or objects, we should always enable symmetry in the X-axis. To do that, expand the Symmetry option and select the X mirror. Alternatively, we can find the X mirror option in the top menu. With the X mirror enabled, we only need to sculpt half of the mesh, as the other half will remain symmetrical. If you're using a graphics tablet, it is a good practice to have the strength pressure enabled. This is because the strength of the brush will be affected by the pressure you put on the pen. More pressure means more strength. If you are using a mouse, it doesn't matter if you have the strength pressure enabled or not, because you are pressing the mouse button to sculpt, and so, the brush won't be affected by the strength pressure at all. Instead, you have to keep changing the strength value according to your needs. With everything ready, we can start sculpting. From the brush menu on the left, we want to select the draw brush. By default, the draw brush will add the effect to the mesh. That can be seen through the plus sign on the top menu. If we select the minus sign, the draw brush will subtract the effect, so to speak. We want to leave the add effect enabled, but we can subtract quickly anytime we need, by pressing and holding Ctrl while sculpting. Wolves have a slight concavity at the top of their heads, and we want to simulate that. So change the brush radius and strength if needed, press and hold Ctrl and start sculpting at the top of the wolf's head. To smoothen the mesh, hold Shift while sculpting. There's also a brush for this in the left menu, but it's much faster and easier to use the Shift key. If we don't hold Ctrl or Shift, we will simply add the selected brush effect to the mesh. Continue sculpting, add and subtract the brush effect and smooth the mesh when needed. Don't forget to use more or less pen pressure if you're using a tablet, or keep changing the brush strength as needed if you're using a mouse. The wolf's snout looks too much rounded at the top, so we can use another brush to flatten it a little bit. We can use the grab brush tool to drag some parts of the wolf's body that might look a little odd. Now we will sculpt some details around the eyes. Select the Draw Brush tool once again and start creating the eyelids of the wolf. Feel free to change the brush type whenever you need it. It's important to know that no matter what brush you're using, the Shift key will always smooth out the mesh. keep in mind that we want some good-looking round eyelids. Because we're sculpting with the x-axis symmetry turned on, the other eye will look exactly the same. Now let's move on to the nose. We will start by creating the philtrum, the narrow groove located in the middle of the mammalian nose. With the Draw Brush tool selected, press and hold Ctrl to dig into the mesh. The nostrils have sharp edges, so we need to smooth them out. One thing you may notice when sculpting is that sometimes it can be difficult to center the viewport on the part of the mesh you are working on. Fortunately, there's an easy fix for this. On the top menu, go to Edit, Preferences. Select Navigation and enable Orbit Around Selection. Now, if we rotate the viewport, it will rotate around the wolf's body, which is our current selection. But if we start sculpting the snout, for example, and then rotate the viewport, we'll notice that it rotates around the last edit we made. That said, let's continue sculpting our model. Now we want to simulate the scaly appearance that the noses of some mammals have. To do this, we will use an alpha texture. There is a link in the description to download the alpha texture we will use in this tutorial, but feel free to use any other texture if you wish. In the Properties panel, go to the Texture tab. Create a new texture. It is always a good practice to rename it, as it will be easier to identify. In the Image Settings, press Open to browse your folders, and select the alpha texture you downloaded before. We're not going to sculpt with the alpha texture the same way we did before, so we need to change some brush settings. So open the stroke settings and change the stroke method to anchored. We also need to change the texture mapping to area plane. The anchored stroke method creates a single dab at the brush location. Clicking and dragging will resize the dab diameter. The area plane texture mapping will scale the alpha texture, rather than maintaining its size and repeating it as with tiled mapping. In short, we will press and hold the pen or mouse in a specific position, and then drag to expand the area that will be affected by the alpha texture. Release it when the alpha texture looks good enough. Repeat the process until the alpha texture effect covers the entire nose. We don't need the alpha texture for now, so we will delete it. But because we might need it later, we will enable the Fake User option. This will keep the texture in the Blender file, even if it has no use at the moment. We want to change the stroke method to dots once again. With the draw brush selected, we will dig around the wolf's nose to mark its edges. Now hold Shift to smooth the snout, and erase the texture outside the nose area. We also want to smooth the inside of the nostrils. Now we're going to sculpt the gums. But to be able to do it easily, we will hide the rest of the wolf's body. Press Tab to enter edit mode. Make sure you have face select active, then place the mouse over the wolf's body and press L to select it. Finally, press H to hide the selection. We divided the wolf into several islands when we unwrapped it in the previous video, so now it's a little easier to hide some parts of the wolf's body. Currently, we want to hide everything except the mouth, so keep pressing L to select the islands and H to hide them. For the feet, it may be quicker to press C, enter wireframe mode, and press B to create a rectangular selection around the paws. We also want to hide the throat and part of the mouth. This will allow us to see the gums better, and it will be easier to sculpt them. Go back to Object Mode. Select and hide the tongue. Now back to Sculpt Mode. Let's start sculpting the gums. We will start by sculpting the gums around the teeth. The teeth have a subdivision surface modifier, but it is not visible in the viewport. It is a good idea to increase the viewport levels in the subdivision surface modifier, so we can see how the gums will behave around the subdivided teeth. Go to the Object Mode. Select the upper teeth. Then open the Modifiers tab in the Properties panel and increase the viewport levels. Do the same with the lower teeth. Select the wolf's body once again and enter Sculpt mode. Now let's continue sculpting the gums. If we need to increase or decrease the smooth brush strength, all we have to do is to select the smooth brush and change the strength. Repeat the process for the lower gums. Now we're going to sculpt the lower part of the mouth. We will hide the upper teeth and the upper part of the mouth so we can see what we're doing. Enter Object Mode. Select the upper teeth and press H to hide them. Then go into Edit Mode, Wireframe, and select the top part of the mouth to hide it. Go back to Sculpt Mode, and make sure you're in Solid Mode. Now let's continue sculpting the gums and mouth. We're going to do the same with the upper part of the mouth. We need to unhide it, and then hide everything else. Also, unhide the upper teeth and hide the lower teeth. Select and hide the tongue. The mouth looks good enough, so let's press Tab to enter edit mode, and then Alt-H to unhide everything. Go back to object mode, and again, unhide everything. Now select the wolf's body and enter sculpt mode once again. Let's sculpt the wolf's snout, right where the whiskers are supposed to be. Time to sculpt the ears. We'll start by creating the ear hole. Adding some effects to the ears. Let's leave the ears for now and continue sculpting some details around the head. Now let's move on to the neck. Back to the ears. Now let's sculpt the wolf's body, to simulate the muscles. We don't need something very precise, just some resemblance to the wolf's muscles. We can use the clay or clay strips brushes. Feel free to search for images of wolves' muscles to help you out. It's time to sculpt some details on the paws. If you have trouble zooming and moving the viewport, simply press Tab to enter edit mode, select a face near the position you want to sculpt, and press Dot or Delete on the numpad to center the viewport. Then go back to sculpt mode. Now we need to sculpt the pads. Don't forget the usefulness of the grab brush. The paw pads will be touching the floor, so they should all end in the same position. Press and hold Alt, and rotate the viewport sideways, to lock it in an orthographic side view. Alternatively, press Ctrl and numpad 3 to go to the left orthographic view, or numpad 3 alone to go to the right orthographic view. Pull the pads till they end up in the same position. We can guide ourselves through the grid. Repeat the process for the hind legs. The carpal pad and the dewclaw pad are still missing. So let's get right into it. We will start with the carpal pad. Next is the dewclaw pad. Now it's time to add an alpha texture effect to the pads. As we did before, open the stroke settings and change the stroke method to anchored. In the Properties panel, open the same texture that we used before and don't forget that the texture mapping should be area plane. Fill the pads with the alpha texture. To finish off the wolf's paw pads, let's add the alpha texture effect to the carpal pad. Feel free to add some more details to the body if you wish. Again, keep looking for references to help you out. We're going to add some details to the wolf's tongue. Go to the Object mode. Select the tongue, and then press Ctrl-I to invert the selection. This will select everything else but the tongue. Press H to hide everything except the tongue. Select the tongue. Now we need to delete the subdivision surface modifier and replace it with a multi-resolution modifier. Subdivide the tongue a few times. It's time to start sculpting again, but first we want to delete the alpha texture, as we won't need it anymore. Change the stroke method to dots. Now let's start adding details to the tongue. To add more detail to the tongue, we can use another alpha texture. There is a link in the description to download the alpha texture we will be using now, but again, feel free to use any other if you wish. In the Properties panel, go to the Texture tab. Create a new texture. In the Image settings, press Open to browse your folders, and select the alpha texture you downloaded before. Don't forget that it is always a good practice to rename it, as it will be easier to identify. Open the stroke settings and change the stroke method to anchored. Make sure the texture mapping is set to area plane. Now let's sculpt the tongue using the alpha texture effect. Remember that if we subdivide the tongue further, we can create more detail and make better use of the alpha texture. But as this comes at a price in performance, we will leave it as is. However, let me exemplify, just so you understand the difference. Let's say that we want the tongue to have more details. We will subdivide it 2 more times. Now if we try to use the alpha texture once again, look at the difference in the details. See how much more realistic it looks. If you have a computer that can handle this easily, feel free to go overboard with the details, otherwise use fewer subdivisions. Finally, we're going to sculpt the wolf's lips. Unhide everything. Select the wolf's body and enter Sculpt mode. Open the stroke settings and change the stroke method back to dots. If you still have any alpha texture selected, delete it. Again, feel free to use reference images to help you out. Wolves and canids in general sometimes have little bumps on their lips. We will simulate this. That's pretty much it. This concludes the tutorial. So if you liked the video and learned something from it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more tutorials. Leave a comment, tell me what you think. Thank you for watching.